Zigler said, I learned sort of the business side, specifically the reimbursement and health economics side of the work that you do. And I became passionate myself, just as you are for your patients, about how you should be paid. You should be reimbursed. You should be have the things that you want to do covered, and you should be paid appropriately for it. So I've spent 16 years in the industry, and I've touched coverage, coding, and payment topics all in my career. And so what I want to talk with you about today are some of my learnings. I want to be very brief and move you along on your agenda. And then I share this agenda with a giant of mine, Kim Norton. Kim was one of my early mentors, one of the early clients that I worked for at MICRA. And so it's really a pleasure to be sharing this topic with her. In fact, I can't believe it. And so I want to talk a little bit about the AMA and the experiences there, because it is a part of your coverage and your payment. You have to focus on the CPT codes, and you have to pay attention to that. So I want to just leave you with a couple of nuggets in the hopes that we can follow up and do all the discussion and discourse necessary. So just a couple of disclaimers. I am Vice President of Reimbursement with SI Bone. I'll be talking about the SI joint experience because I think IFUs and the SI bone reimbursement experience, at least, whatever your feelings are clinically about SI joint fusion as a procedure, I think everyone agrees that the reimbursement experience is one of the darlings in the industry. So I want to talk with you about that, if only to compare and contrast for cervical and lumbar ADR. And also, of course, any opinions are mine and my own and not my company's. So want to leave you with a couple of experiences and some examples of the coverage and payment, but particularly as the coding sort of relates to that and wags that dog. And we'll leave you with some of the latest updates on reimbursement for cervical and lumbar ADR. But the things that I want to have you take away from this, if I only have a few more minutes and I'm going to lose you in 90 seconds, as I just want to tell you to have energy in this process. I know that you don't have any time in your week, and you probably already have side hustles and you're doing other things anyway, and you do not have any minutes for your societies or for a survey or to just chip in on a call or even to just write an email. But I'm here to implore you that you have to do that. It's all stemming from, if they don't hear from you individually, and then if they don't hear from a whole bunch of you collectively, even your societies who are dedicated and passionate to trying to do that reimbursement thing for you or that mechanism for you, they're just not going to have that much energy around it because they didn't hear from you. And I see it all the time. As I said, I attend most of the CPT panel meetings, and I sort of watch the politics wash away what makes sense and what I think an individual surgeon might have wanted. It's just not enough because the energy isn't there. So that's just the one general tenet that I've learned. And then have resolve. Decide on perhaps maybe one, just two topics that you care about, and then dig in hard. And you should be reaching out to your coding and reimbursement committee at NAS, AAOS, ISAS, all the usual players, because they'll fight for you. And if you get all of your friends to also believe what you believe, then you can make the phone calls happen, and then you should push them and have that resolve next to that energy. That's the next major tenet. And then lastly, be in concert. Those parts of medicine that are sort of winning at this reimbursement game, let's call it, are aligned from the individual clinicians or surgeons, what have you, all the way up to their societies and the companies in between. Everybody is in lockstep. Nobody is fighting with each other. And unfortunately, the state of the union for spine is not what I just said. You are not aligned. And I'm sorry to be the one to say it. I know this is sort of an important topic, but the more that you can all get aligned on whatever the next motion preservation or fusion topic is that's most important for your patients, that's how you push through all of the things and committees and trappings that happen in a major process like code development and coverage by payers. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk with you a little bit about a case study in SI joint fusion. As I mentioned, I am Vice President of Market Access and Reimbursement for SI Bone. So I have a little bit of experience. And one of the things that I fell into when I joined the company 5 years ago was they'd already had sort of a marvelous reimbursement turnaround experience from having no code whatsoever to just a few years later having near universal coverage. And in fact, 30 payers required the IFUs triangle implant separate and exclusive of everything else on the market. And there was another 10 or 15 devices at that point on the market. Now it's much more saturated, and some of those payer coverage policies are clawing back. But that's what I walked into. And one of the earliest learnings I got was from the then CEO of SI Bone, Jeff Dunn. And Jeff Dunn said, payer medical director once said to me, I have 100 topics that I review a year. Why would I ever think about you? And why would you be in the top 100, let alone the top, 10 or 20 that you need to be for me to cover you? So that was sort of what we learned early on, was that you have to be that tenacious and do all the things I said on the other slide: have energy, have alignment, and resolve, and never stop, and go to where they live, go to their meetings and go to meet those medical directors where they are. But Kim's going to talk a lot more about that. I was hoping to touch on the CPT code experience. So as I mentioned, I attend a lot of the panel meetings. And when I say panel, I mean the editorial panel. So there's two houses in the AMA, basically. There is the CPT editorial panel, which discusses the code descriptors and the language. And then there is the RUC, which is the relative value update committee. And so that's who decides the value of all the codes. And each of those panels and committees, for lack of a better phrase, have membership. And so it's a sort of a somewhat rolling basis of who chairs and who is on those editorial panel. For instance, up on the screen, the RUC has a few more members than does the editorial panel. But this is the concept: if you have a group of 21 or a group of 31 decision makers who hear an applicant's pitch and then decide whether to continue hearing it out that day, to table it, to have the applicant come back another time, or to go ahead and vote on whether that application should be a code or whether it should be valued a certain way. And all of that's done in sort of a quasi-public forum. Some of them are on Zoom, some of them are live, and some of them are by invite only as the process progresses. And so I mentioned societies and alignment with your societies, as well as helping your societies to understand what topics they should be pushing for and why it's important, well in advance of a given application for a code going up before the panel. I mean, it's sort of like that old adage: if you haven't done it all before, the curtain drops, then you really haven't figured it out. So you have to have everything lined up before the day in court or the day in the panel. And so I've highlighted just a couple of the spine societies, or the societies that would get involved or at least have opinions about spine topics. But every one of these really pushes to be part of this process. There is a really interesting book that I'm going to recommend. If you want to pull out your phones, you can take down a QR code that gets into this House of Medicine, as they call it. And so each of these societies has pushed to have this seat that's up on the screen right now. This is public. This is available on the AMA's website. Of course, you should refer to the AMA for a much more in-depth discussion of this topic. But from my perspective, this is an important topic for each of these societies to have gotten to this point, because it means they have a say officially, and can turn the neck of that CPT panel or the RUC, as I showed you on the other slide. And so whenever the topic comes up that's germane for them, that's when they sort of provide their comments, either in advance, as I said, that's most important, or the day of, if that becomes necessary. And then there's sort of a spaghetti process that occurs once the application goes in. You have the editorial panel go first to decide whether it should be a code and what the code's language should look like. Then it goes to the RUC. And sometimes you have a code that is a category 3 or tracking code. Those are meant to be temporary in nature, transient, such that later the applicant ostensibly or somebody else would come back and go get a permanent code, or it's called a category 1 CPT code. And that's the difference between sort of the T code that you may recall from some of the earlier days, even in the lumbar disc replacement example, now given way to 22856 and 57 that we saw earlier from Dr. Cheng's discussion. And when it came to the SI joint fusion code, CPT 27279 was actually requested by NASS. It had come out of a need to distinguish between the open version of SI joint fusion that was a 100-year-old procedure to this newer MIS version. So NAS requested the code. We had a T code for about a year and a half, during which the company spent money and invested in themselves and put forth level 1 and 2 studies that I'll show you in a bit that paid dividends. It was done specifically for the CPT code to get the permanent code. However, it really allowed us to take off in the market. So this is that book recommendation. Again, this is just my opinion for informational purposes only, but I found this book to be fascinating. An investigative reporter interviewed current and former CPT members under anonymity, and boy, it's just a fascinating read. If you're at all halfway interested in learning how you can get involved, I promise everybody in that room and everybody listening on the line is more than capable to be able to get a little bit more involved if you'd like. So it's called Fixing Medical Prices. Again, I have no affiliation with this author. I really just love the book. In fact, I read it while attending a RUC meeting. I was blown away. And so, there's a somewhat, I said high, but it's really just a somewhat high literature bar for CPT codes. You need to have at least 5 papers. One of them needs to be either an RCT paper or a meta-analysis type paper on the subject of the CPT code, and there needs to be some non-overlapping authors. So there's some bars that need to be met, but most of the time the code doesn't come down to that. It usually comes down to widespread use in the community and whether basically the CPT panel believes that there would be enough physicians to take a survey for the value should it ever become a real code and go over to that valuation committee, the RUC that I mentioned. So a lot of times, different applications die in the vine for different reasons. But in the example of SI joint fusion, I mentioned SI bone had their dark period. They were put into a T code and it wasn't looking good for a couple of years. But what they did was, spent more money invested, and then they put together a few clinical trials, one in the US, one in Europe at the same time, one RCT and one prospective, such that they had all the mix-ins to be able to make whatever meta-analyses or papers that would be published from it. And I think now there's been approaching probably 120 or 130 papers on iFuse alone, whether independent research or, of course, industry sponsored. And I have to say, Dr. Chapman, when you brought up the topic of the Washington State Healthcare Authority, we also applied to them for SI joint fusion to be covered, and they did not allow us in, much to our chagrin. And the main sticking point was industry bias and sponsorship of studies. So that's not in this talk, but that is a major issue that's never going to change, ever, that we all have to figure out how to push back on the right decision makers about, because it's just not right. And like I said, there's just never going to be a different makeup of all these studies. Who's going to pay for it? So we have all the iFuse studies, and I guess I'll show you the point. We were able to parlay all of those level 1 and 2 studies into some decisions among the medical directors. And again, I say this is with, keep in your mind, our CEO and and a couple of our other surgeons, of course, helping us at the time push, and really be relenting with all of these payers and make them aware of all these pieces of literature at all the time points. So that's why there happened to also be some other things like no one else was around, and so it was only iFuse or conservative therapy. So that was a difference, I think, in the lumbar and cervical ADR experience from what happened with iFuse. But you just need to ask some of those questions of industry bias. If I'm telling you that it's such a great reimbursement experience, but authorities like the Washington Healthcare Authority don't like it because there's industry bias, that's a problem. And that's really odd. So we need to figure out how to fix that. But the last thing is sort of a little invective. It's asking about whether there's a threat to existing spine CPT codes. I think that's also something you need to ask yourself as you go to your societies who are CPT advisors. You need to be asking, well, what would this be sort of taking away from, or what would be the perception if this new code were to be added to the code set? So with that, I don't want to go too far on my time. I want to cede the microphone over to Kim, who's going to take it from here, and I'll run your slides. Kim, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, Kim.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for inviting me to participate in this, first of all, and great job on SI bone. That's definitely a darling story, and you've been a big driver of that. So Congratulations. And Dr. Zigler, I want to say thank you for the compliment, but truly, it's on the backs of all of you in this room. I can't see all of you, but I know most of you. And I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. It's been relentless, and you're really the ones who have driven this. So thank you for that. So with that, I wanted to just spend a couple minutes talking about reimbursement for cervical and lumbar TDR. I think it's helpful to have a refresher because this has been going on for 17 years of my life, certainly. But I've talked to a couple people recently who didn't know all the history, and certainly the medical directors haven't kept up with the history. So I think it's important we all know it so that especially when we're talking to payers, they understand the context as well, but also to compare and contrast cervical with lumbar. I think it's been a very different story, and you'll see why. And many of you know this history. So if it's repetitive, I'm sorry, and I'll go through it pretty quickly, but when the discs were approved, it's been a long time. And again, the lumbar and cervical disc reimbursement history has been really different. And I think it's for a number of reasons, but I think the two primary reasons are, I think the data that showed a distinction with fusion over time was naturally faster with cervical discs. So we got there faster, and I'll show you that on the coverage curve. With cervical, it took 4 or 5 years to show a true difference in terms of adjacent level disease. And I think with lumbar, it's taken closer to 8 to 10. And so we're really only just now getting some of that long-term data published. I also will show you why lumbar disc coverage was dead on arrival. And it was an unfortunate story, and it's one we don't want to relive. And it's fascinating, actually. At some point, it would be a great case study. But Jeff, if you can go to the next slide, I'll walk you through that. And I had to remind myself of some of this history as well. So basically what happened was, as you saw, the first lumbar disc was approved in 2004. In 2005, Dr. Deo requested that CMS, or Medicare, conduct a national coverage determination for Charité, which had just been approved. And I think he was naturally just skeptical of degenerative disc disease treatment. I don't know if there was more going on there, if there were other people involved, but basically he submitted a letter, asked CMS to look at it. And it's clear what's going to happen, right? The Charité pivotal study was 18 to 60 years old. There's no Medicare data. There's no Medicare age patients, basically. So there was nothing to justify a positive national coverage determination. So CMS issued a negative NCD for Charité in 2006, and then they looked at ProDisc after it got approved and also denied that. Again, no Medicare patients. So the other thing that happened was CMS had also put lumbar TDR into a low-paying inpatient DRG. I forget the number, but it's now in DRG 518. At the time, it's just not important, but it was a low-paying DRG. So J&J, which had launched Charité, had to apply for what's known as an NTAP, a new technology add-on payment, to try to boost that reimbursement for the inpatient facility payment. And when you do that, you have to justify the cost criterion by sort of pushing your price higher. And they did that. But unfortunately, the NTAP was denied because there was no superiority data. And again, no Medicare data. This is a Medicare payment. And so it was denied. But now you've got a negative NCD, you've got a relatively high price, and a lot of press and attention around both of those things. And so all of the commercial payers, literally every single one, just shut the door. They said no coverage, non-coverage out of the gate. And it's really taken us all 17 years to mostly recover from that. But I will tell you, I talked to some medical directors last week who still have this perception that it shouldn't be covered because of this old NCD. And we've had no success in trying to get CMS to remove the NCD, even though it's not really relevant to them. It just doesn't matter, but they will not do it. So we continue to be stuck with that. However, we've recovered, like I said, to some degree. And Jeff, if you can move to the next slide. You'll see that in 2012, that was really a low point because Aetna had covered Charité because J&J used Aetna as their insurer. So they got Aetna to cover. When Charité was withdrawn from the market in 2012, basically Aetna revoked their coverage. They said it was because of their merger with Coventry, but it was really because, Charité was now off the market and they never really wanted to cover it. So now we're at our lowest point in 2012. And basically what happened was we kind of lingered there. You all tried to fight. We got a little more data published, and then Activell launched and got FDA approved, and Sentinel took over ProDisc. So now you've got some resources, some advocacy, some hotlines pushing patient appeals. In addition, a bunch of lawsuits, which, class action lawsuits take a very long time. The Blue Shield lawsuit finally happened, the United class action lawsuit happened, and then more recently, the Aetna class action lawsuit, forcing these payers to cover. And now in 2023, we're at basically somewhere between 85 to 90% coverage. But it's taken that long, and it's taken a lot of fighting and a lot of lawsuits. And then 2-Level obviously launched in like late 2018, 2019, and that's already getting better. We're at about 27% coverage on 2-Level. And I think that will go faster now and catch up at least with the 85 to 90%. Jeff? Cervical has been very different. And again, for many reasons. Cervical pathology, as I mentioned, it's generally less controversial with payers than DDD. No access surgeons needed. The outcomes data have been faster to show adjacent level disease differences. Industry and surgeons really learned from that lumbar TDR experience about how to address reimbursement with the payers. And I think patients have also been more involved in demanding TDR as an alternative. But also there was no coverage at launch, as opposed to when lumbar TDR was launched and there was non-coverage. So that's been a huge difference. Next slide, Jeff. So what happened here was, again, Prestige launched, ProDisc C launched, and then the 4-year ProDisc C data was published. United issued a positive coverage policy, and really all the commercial plans followed after that. That was a huge deal to have United covering. And then Mobi-C was launched, which again put more resources behind cervical. And 2-Level really caught up very quickly once Mobi-C launched that 2-Level indication. And even Aetna now, and I don't know why, but they're covering hybrid TDR fusion. So we'll take it. I'm not sure who requested it or if they just decided to do that, but they're really one of the first who's covering hybrid, even though there's nobody indicated for it specifically. So that's encouraging. So we're at 100% coverage for cervical TDR. I know there's some minor issues here and there, but for the most part, everyone covers it. Even Medicare under age 60 tends to cover it. Work comp, TRICARE, it's generally considered covered. Next slide. So where the rubber hits the road is payment. And I know you've probably all talked about this today. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be on earlier. But here's what happened. When the CPT codes were established, and Jeff talked about the process, which I think is really helpful, but when those codes were established for both lumbar and cervical, the valuation of those codes was really impacted by a number of things. One was bad timing. The AMA, the Relative Value Update Committee, was really focused on bundling CPT codes. So where you have a fusion, you can do add-on codes with cages and plates, et cetera. They were moving toward pulling everything into one code versus having add-on codes. So the timing was really bad. There was also, I think, some mistakes made with the rep surveys that went out. There weren't a lot of, they weren't handled well. There weren't a lot of responses. And so basically, the responses came back very low. And so ultimately the value established for both codes is now about the same as the arthrodesis codes just alone. But when you add on the add-on codes, then you see a huge difference between, for 1-Level, not a huge difference, but a difference. And for 2-Level or more, obviously a huge difference when you add on cage and plate codes. So the valuation is less, and you're basically asking you to do a procedure that's, as challenging, if not more than a TDR, but get paid less for it. And that's really been, I think, what's held these procedures back, if anything. Certainly coverage for lumbar, but that's been mostly resolved. And unfortunately, a fix would mean we've tried to get those codes revalued. CMS, AMA want nothing to do with it. So it means the 22845 value would have to come down on the plate code, and that's never going to happen. That code hasn't been re-reviewed since 1997. I don't think it'll ever be re-reviewed. And so that difference is always going to be there. And that's what we have to live with and just keep trying to work with, unfortunately. Jeff? So to wrap this up, like I said, we're at about 85 to 90% coverage for lumbar 1 level, about 27% for 2 level. I think that'll catch up quickly. TDR is 100% coverage. Lumbar TDR has been held back by coverage, but I think also limited indications. The coverage policies are still narrow, even when they are positive. There is a need for an access surgeon, which eats into that total payment, and ongoing controversy over DVD. That's really why Aetna didn't cover, and they had to get forced into covering. And then certainly the payment levels. And cervical TDR, I think, is only really held back by payment at this point. And I think with your continued advocacy and hopefully some continued work with CMS and AMA, we'll ultimately get there, and the future will be bright for motion. And we've come a very long way. And again, that's thanks to all of you in this room. So thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to have this discussion with you guys today.
Thanks, Kim. So before anyone actually at the microphone there, I was hoping I could actually tag on to what you were talking about, Kim, with the undervaluation of the code. That is a tough one, and it's a lot of, you get the one shot at the AMA. However, again, in the example of SI joint fusion, we actually went back and appealed to CMS successfully that code was at the time undervalued because of a similar kind of RUC survey thing. But we went to CMS and they heard us out, and then they put it in the proposed rule. And then a magical thing happened. 100 surgeons all commented very briefly, but from the heart, straight to CMS in the public domain in the rule. And so between the proposed rule and then a couple months later, the final rule, they completely turned CMS around 180, and it resulted in a 27% increase to the work RVUs. Unheard of. Usually it goes down, not up. But that's the power, just to bring it back full circle from the part of my talk, is just decide what you're passionate about and don't be bashful. Just tell the decision makers and the authorities what the procedure is that you're doing is worth, because no one's going to know it but you. So.
Hey, Jeff, of those 100 doctors that commented, how many of them were pain doctors versus orthopedic or neurosurgeons?
Thanks, Dr. Blumenthal. No, at the time that was not an issue. There were no non-surgeons at the time that would have commented on that. This was all surgeons talking about the procedure they performed at the time.
So is that a loophole we could pursue for arthroplasty, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much a loophole as it is, a process that CMS reviews each year, what they call potentially misvalued codes. And that's capital P, capital M, capital C. So it's a program, it's a process. As I say, usually the program is used to sort of take codes down, not up. But as you can see, CMS hears out anything on the list. And what they do is they take a couple of private meetings, during their off season, before they have to go dark, as they say, to work on the rule. And then by the time of that proposed rule, you would have had the meetings with Medicare staff. They would have understood you doctor to doctor. They have, medical directors there that understand you. And then they would huddle up and say, well, okay, this potentially misvalued code should be put up in the proposed rule that year. And it's not to say that that's definitely what will happen or what they'll do, but that gives you another shot. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think that's another reason why this negative NCD has really affected us, because CMS has that, they're not as inclined to look at changing the value on the code because it's not covered. So my goal ultimately, and I won't retire until I get this done, is to get that NCD removed, because I really think that would free up all of those things, the payment discussions, the rest of the coverage, all that stuff that holds us back.
Hey, Jeff, explain to me, I understand about the coding and having to go through Medicare. So if we could get our code reimbursed higher for the artificial disc, does it come from another code? Now, do you have to rob Peter to pay Paul?
Sure.
And by the way, great talk and great seeing you.
You too, Dr. Carter. Yeah, that is absolutely what happens at a big picture level. It's not like anyone is actually counting the beans, and but yes, your societies are generally worried about that, generally thinking about the impact of bringing on one, because then it does affect the rest of the pot. But it's not as exactly a one-to-one. As you can see, there was no immediate and direct impact that was at least perceptible by me for increasing that SI joint fusion code. It affected what? And yes, in the grand math, it might, that we were given 3 or 4 more work RVUs, sure. But that's just a big picture thing. And your society is working hard for you. Don't get me wrong. Please do not get me wrong. I'm just encouraging you to let them know what they should think about first and foremost, and how much they should think about it when it comes due.
All right, this one's for Kim, and you and I have talked about it a little bit, and when it comes down to, and let's focus on lumbar, the devil's in the details. 2 examples. Number one is we were so excited to have a level 1 code for the 2nd level lumbar arthroplasty, and we were getting reimbursed much higher when it was a T code, and for what's the Texas one, HCSC or whatever?
Yeah.
Our 2nd level now, our average reimbursement for a lumbar TDR 2nd level is $200, which is, well, we could see a new patient in the office for that.
Wow. That's lower than the Medicare rate.
Pardon?
That's lower than the Medicare rate.
Well, yeah, well, I'm just saying this. We've looked at our EOBs for Texas Blue Cross.
Wow.
The second issue in this one specifically, I remember talking about, was the whole Aetna thing. So when Aetna initially lost the class action lawsuit, we were so excited. We had patients waiting for that. And we had 100% basically denials after that, to the point where I was talking to one of the 1-800 doctors and eventually got to the medical director, who sat through the class action lawsuit. And what they were doing is they were the only company that were so strictly adhering to the 12 on-label indications that if one was missing, he told his review doctors to turn it down. And on the phone, I said, so really, you're just kind of mad about the decision and you're not going to cover it. He goes, that's true.
Yeah.
Then they sued, I guess, and Jack knows this better than I do. Then I guess they were negotiating the details of the settlement, and they went back to the judge and said, never mind, we don't want to, we want to dispute the judgment. They lost that. And since that time, they actually have loosened up a little bit, and we've gotten a couple of Aetnas approved, but there's still a huge divergence amongst the carriers of, quote unquote, how far off label they'll go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no patient is, well, very few patients are perfect that fulfill every criteria. And most you can get, them to overlook something mild. Aetna was doing none of that at first. They are a little bit now, but it's a guessing game because you don't know, which of these review companies they use, because they change their criteria. It seems like every 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
We've gone through, previous surgery is a contraindication. Well, previous surgery was part of the IDE studies. They just kind of made that up, and we had to go back to United, and Rick, Jack, and I had to write a letter to United, and right after they started covering, within 3 months, they were covering non-destabilizing posterior decompressions, which is on label based on the IDE studies. It's very frustrating because with every victory, you also get 2 steps backwards because they'll figure out some evil way to inflict their pound of flesh.
I know, and it just takes constant advocacy. It's so frustrating, and I think so. Let me take it a couple points at a time. I think first of all, I'm starting to see payers open up on the previous surgery criteria. There's been a few Blue Cross Blue Shield plans that have opened that up. They are saying no previous fusion, but they're starting to make it looser in terms of discectomies, et cetera, at the index level or even at the adjacent level. So I'm encouraged by that. I think that's going to spread. And I think more and more payers are going to open that up. And you know, there's a paper now. I'll share that with all the medical directors, and hopefully we can get them to push the envelope on that. And certainly all of you have continued to do that and advocate for your individual patients, but Aetna really does not want to cover this. They don't cover anything for DDD, you know, and we've been on calls with them where I remember you saying, well, what do you want us to do with these patients? And it was literally just keep going to rehab. I mean, that's crazy. So the fact that they got forced into covering means that they're going to be very difficult. We have to keep track of all those cases, go back to the attorney and have him go back to the company and the judge and say, look, they're not meeting the spirit of the law, even if they meet the letter of the law. The class action lawsuits are never over, even when they're settled. So we just have to keep track of that. And
I will say, sorry not to interrupt you, Kim, but
Yeah.
I will say one glimmer of hope here is Aetna happens to perform its own reviews, and they have their own nurses
Yep.
reviewing and medical directors. But there is a major push among the payer community to do these specialty benefits management companies, and so they farm out the work
Yes.
to another company. So while the parent that was sued might be upset and might want to exact revenge, actually the third party administrator or the company that's doing it, they don't care.
Yeah.
I'll
Well,
tell you one thing that works being a high volume arthroplasty center is the Carillon review doctors know the three of us, you know, we're on first name basis here. You know, I'm reviewing your case. I can approve
That's
this one.
one
I
of them.
can't approve that one.
Good.
And frankly, the gray zone ones, we have a better chance of getting approved, you know, just based on, you know, talking to these guys all the time.
And just to carry that one step forward, it depends on who you're talking to. Sometimes, you know, they'll say, well, you know, did the patient have this? And they may not have had it. And we say, yes. And he says, well, what about this? Yes, yes. Okay, I can approve it. But it varies. They, you know, they are not consistent in what they'll approve and not approve. And it's such a game. It's like we have to advocate and even lie for our patients to get approval.
You know, like everything else in the world, everything's harder. So you just need to be that much more vigorous about everything and push that much harder. That's the one thing I've learned in the past decade. I've watched it change a little bit, just in my tenure.
I really think the medical director.
We would never lie. We
Yeah.
don't.
I think the medical directors are very stuck in the old days. They don't really understand where lumbar disc has come. And I think we also need to do a better job of educating them about how far these discs have come, the outcomes, all the things the good things that are happening with these patients, because they're still thinking, you know, 2007, 2008, and that's not what's happening anymore. So we've got to get them unstuck from their thinking, and I think all of us can participate in that.
Kim, you're exactly right. When a reviewer says to me, well, we think it's experimental, I say, whoa, whoa, whoa. I said, I know what your company's policy is. And then I give them a 5-minute, you know, little education about, we've been doing this for 23 and a half years and so on and so forth.
But most of the first and second tier people that we talk to just are reading the computer screen. And sometimes, you know, they're honest enough to say, listen, I think you're right, but I can't do anything, you know, at this level. You've got to appeal, you got to take it through 2 appeals, then you got to go to an independent review. And, you know, it's just everything is a delaying tactic, a stalling tactic, and most patients just don't have the stomach for it. So it's just incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, I get that.
Kim and Jeff, this is Tony Viscogliosi asking a question for you about the national non-coverage decision that was issued way back in 2006 or so. Is there a regulatory process to change that decision?
Yes, there is. Probably about 7 years ago, CMS issued a process to request that NCDs be removed. And we went through that process and they refused. And so I think it's probably time, with some of the change in leadership there, to go back and ask for it again. they really didn't give a reason other than we don't need to. Why they wouldn't remove that NCD, it doesn't affect them in any way, shape, or form. This is not their patient population for the most part. So there's no reason to remove to keep it. So I think it's time to go back and ask again because some of that leadership has changed. But yes, there's a process.
So therefore, who leads that process? Does industry lead it, or does the surgeon community lead it?
Industry will have to lead it, but the surgeons will have to get involved. So I think we need to regroup on that, get back together, submit, through the process, and then get surgeons to submit comments. It's a great question.
That's a
Needs
fight
to be done.
We're all happy to do together.
Absolutely. And we want Jeff
Yeah.
Zigler on our side.
It's time.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Kim. It was really
Thank you.
been wonderful.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for hanging in there.